if you're joining me as this video has dropped, I hope you're having a fantastic Christmas holiday, whatever it is that you're doing. Now, today I'm really excited to jump into yet another Batman themed video because McFarlane Toys are really pushing the boat out with the license lately, and this time they have a line dedicated to Batman the Animated Series. Now, I don't need to wax lyrical about that series. If you grew up in the 90s, I'm sure you're very familiar with it and have a lot of love for it if you are a Batman fan, and even if you've grown up past that, I'm sure you've referenced it or come across it in your time because it is one of those all-time seminal animated TV shows, and particularly a high benchmark for superhero animated shows in particular. Now, as excited as I am that we have a brand new series of figures dedicated to Batman the Animated Series, I must admit that I'm left scratching my head with this one, and there's a little bit of cynicism creeping in here because, interestingly, McFarlane Toys have opted for a different scale. We all know that their DC Multiverse line is produced in the 7-inch scale. These figures, however, are produced in the 6-inch scale, which is a little bit odd and the first red flag to me. The other thing you'll notice when we look at the packaging is that this clearly indicates that this is a joint venture with DC Collectibles, and I think, well, I suspect they've reused the molds from the previous line of figures that I already collected, but with some tweaks to the paint and materials used. But let's see what you think as we dive into this. So today I'm going to start off by taking a look at the headliners, Batman and Robin. In terms of the packaging, it is the same for every figure in this way, so I'm just going to focus on the Batman here. Now, I have to say, one of my big gripes with the DC Multiverse line from McFarlane Toys is that it tends to be a little bit dull and underwhelming, and that is not the case here. I'm really pleased with the approach they've taken to this packaging. It's really colourful, it's really fun, and it really feels very much like the series vibe. I think they've done a really fantastic job with the artwork on this, and it looks fantastic. Now, it is in that sort of standard oversized packaging that we've seen from McFarlane Toys for the DC Multiverse line. It's quite wide. We tend to see this with builder figures, and of course this is a builder figure wave, and we'll come to that a little bit later. I'll do a special video just on the Condiment King. But here you can see, obviously, this is really bright and colourful. We have the fantastic logo, the image there of Batman with his cowl in shadow. At the bottom of the packaging, this looks really attractive. The colour is really bright. I love the sort of mauve, sort of reddy kind of colour that they've gone for, and just overall this just really pops really nice. We have mostly window display, but it's just a lot more colourful, and I think it works really, really well. It's very attractive and eye-catching. Likewise, if we flip it and look at the side panel, this is what I'm talking about. Whenever I complain about the approach that McFarlane Toys take with the DC Multiverse line, I always say I wish they'd have the character on the side panel so that when you stack them up on the shelf, you can have a pretty fun collective image here of the various characters, and it looks really fun on display. And in fact, you can do that. Let's have a look at this wave here, and you can see this looks so much better than just having the name of the character on the side. This is really fun to look at, and it just serves a much more visual purpose when you have them on display on your shelf. So I think this looks absolutely fantastic. I love the images they've gone for. They've taken them directly from the source material, and I think this looks really colourful, really fun, and I commend McFarlane Toys. Please, please do this with your DC Multiverse line. Okay, and then finally, if we look at the back of the packaging, we can see here, again, they've got a really colourful image here, this time of the Build-A-Figure character, which is Condiment King, and you can see the various parts that make him up. And at the bottom, you can see the other characters that are available in this line. Now, sadly, this is the same for every single figure. There's nothing really different in the packaging except that side panel profile. But this is a marked step up, a marked improvement over what we normally get. And as I say, I definitely commend McFarlane Toys for doing this. So, looking at the figure outside of the packaging, I have to admit my first impressions, I had this real strong sense of deja vu because there's something about this figure that just felt like I already owned this guy. And then I noticed the DC Collectibles logo on the side of the packaging underneath the McFarlane Toys logo. And I realised that, yeah, I think McFarlane Toys have essentially recycled the parts of the previous line from DC Collectibles, because a lot of these pieces look and feel exactly the same, except with some key differences. So let's take a look at the sculpt. Now, I think this is a really good sculpt. I think they've done a fantastic job, and indeed, if they have recycled the DC Collectibles line, that makes entire sense because I was really happy with those figures. I thought they were tremendous, and to this day, they're one of my favourite ever Batman toy lines. I think they just did a really good job of nailing the likenesses, and that's clearly extended over here. Where things feel different though is how McFarlane Toys have approached these molds, because they've used different materials. Those DC collectible figures were produced in a very matte kind of plastic, and they had a nice texture to them. These are a lot more glossy, and they offer something a little bit different in terms of the texture, which is not a bad thing, it's just different, and I think it works equally well actually. The other thing that you'll notice with these figures, of course, is that they have applied cell shading. This is something the original run of the DC collectibles line didn't have. They did start experimenting with this with some reissues later on, but initially they didn't do this. So McFarlane Toys have really gone deep with this, and I think, you know, it really depends on your personal preference. I'm actually really in favour of cell shading. I really like it. I know a lot of fans are really turned off by this, so it really comes down to your personal preference. I think it works particularly well on the Batman. It definitely gives that feel from the animated series. It gives it a bit more depth and texture, and for me, I'm really happy because, again, one of the things I always criticise McFarlane Toys for is the fact that they don't utilise enough paint apps and shading and things like that, and here we've got this in abundance, and it works really, really well. Interestingly, they've given him a cloth cape. It's quite a hard synthetic material. It's not a soft cotton as we've seen in previous Batman figures, but this works really well. I personally prefer this over having a hard plastic cape or even a thick rubber one. This is something I tend to criticise Batman figures for in the past. I think this works really well. It has that flexibility and it just looks a bit more lifelike. It also adds a nice different texture and depth to the figure as well. Now, I'm sure the thinking behind this is because they are also releasing a bat cycle that your Batman can sit on. I'm sure it has everything to do with that, but I'm really glad that they thought that through and made sure that they provided him with a flexible cape here, which is great news. Okay, so let's take a look at the articulation. Now, he does have a ball joint at the top of the neck, but just like the DC Multiverse line, he's a little bit limited. He can move his head all the way around, and it will tilt side to side. It can also look up and down. Well, it can look up, it can't really look down, but it's not bad. He does have ball joints in the shoulders. Sadly, there's no butterfly wing joint, which is a real shame. The upper arm will rotate around. There is no complementary bicep swivel, which is a shame. He's got a pin swivel at the elbow. It's only single joint. He does have an extra swivel at the top of the gauntlet, which is nice, and then he also has a swivel at the wrist as well, allowing the hand to rotate all the way around, and it will also hinge forwards and backwards. Now, there is articulation in the waist. He will move from side to side. It is a straight swivel. And then he has this rather awkward looking chest joint as well, which is another sort of swivel effect where it will allow him to sort of move forwards and backwards, except for the love of trying, I could not get it to work. Mine was so incredibly stiff, and I really felt that if I forced this anymore, something would snap. So I couldn't get any use out of this. Now, he does have ball joints in the hips. They will kick out to the side. And they'll sort of kick forwards, but they tend to kick out more at a diagonal, which is a little bit unfortunate. Nevertheless, he does have a double joint at the knee, which is pleasing to see, so he can kick that lower leg all the way back there. And you'll also notice he actually has an extra swivel at the top of the boot, which is really cool and unexpected, and I think that works pretty well. And then finally, he does have a sort of ankle pivot. He can arc his foot forwards and backwards. It hinges forwards and backwards nicely, but it will also spin from side to side as well. I'm pleased to say he does come with quite a few accessories, not something McFarlane Toys is known for these days, so they've definitely taken things up a peg, which is great. He comes with an additional 4 pairs of hands, his grapple gun and a grapple gun with hands, so it's moulded into place, which is great, and of course a batarang. I'm pleased to say that in both gripping hands he can hold the batarang nice and easily, likewise his grapple gun as well, and there's enough here to create enough different looks and appearances to really make your Batman stand out on display and create different poses. And I have to say, this feels pretty complete. There's not much else I would think of adding to this version of Batman. I think they've done a really nice job here of covering the bases, and as I said, they're very fun and very pleasing to see that it actually has a good amount of accessories. In terms of a scale comparison then, here he is standing next to the DC Collectibles Greg Capullo Batman line. Now, I believe that Greg Capullo Batman's actually in the 7-inch scale, but there's clearly a height difference here. It's quite minimal, so I'm not sure if it's actually in the 6-inch scale. It's hard to tell because there's not really much in it between these two figures, but nevertheless you can see here obviously the clear differences between these two figures. Here he is now standing next to the McFarlane Hush Batman, which is very much in the 7-inch scale, and you can clearly see the size differential between these two versions of the figure. And then finally here he is standing next to a standard Marvel Legends 6-inch action figure, and these actually scale quite nicely against each other, which is pleasing to see, so I think this works pretty well. So then, all in all, final thoughts on the Batman, I'm going to give him 4 stars. Now, given that this figure is essentially recycled with a new paint job and slightly different materials used, you've got to ask yourself whether this figure is worth the double dip. And really, that all comes down to your feelings and your preference when it comes to cell shading. And I think that ultimately has to be the deciding factor here. Now, for me personally, I really like it. I'm very happy with making the double dip here. I think this looks really, really good, and I'm happy to invest in this line. If you're not keen though, I probably suggest you go down the path of trying to track down the previous releases, although that might be tricky on the secondary market these days. Okay, so let's move on to the Robin figure. Now I have to say, I'm always quite excited to pick up an animated series Robin because he's much more colourful and more vibrant than the Batman, although his frame is a lot smaller, which can be a problem for posing and his joints, etc. So let's see how this version fares. So once again, it seems to be utilising the sculpt that we've already seen from the DC Collectibles line, but it's a great sculpt. I think it looks really good, and I think they've done a nice job with the overall look and aesthetic of the figure. I'm hesitant to use the phrase paint apps because this is probably where I have to argue with myself about the cell shading, because as much as I usually love it, I think it hasn't been well applied here. I think it looked really good on the Batman. It seemed very complementary with the tones of the face and on the suit, and it worked really well here. It doesn't seem to be so complimentary. In fact, it looks really distracting and a little bit odd to me. He seems to have this very strange mustard line across his face and over his arms, and it's very distracting. I don't know whether it's just the tone of it or whether it's how it's been placed, but it just looks off and weird, and it's just not a pleasant colour. And yeah, this doesn't work for me. It doesn't look like Shadow, it just looks like a mess. So I'm not as enthused with this at all, which is a shame because, as you know, I'm a huge defender of the cell shading on figures, but I can definitely see that it doesn't work very well here. The other complaint I have with this Robin figure is the cape. The previous version that I owned, it was a hard cape, but it was more of a rubber and it was a bit more flexible. This is like a really hard plastic, and there's basically no give in it, which is definitely going to cause problems when we look at the articulation. He has a ball joint at the top of the neck, so he can spin his head all the way around, which is good stuff. He can lean it left and right a pretty healthy distance too, which is really nice to see, and he can look up a really good distance, but again, he can't really look down. Now, he does have ball joints in the shoulder, so he can lift his arm out and he can rotate it around. There looks like there's a bicep swivel there, but no, there isn't. It's just how it looks. Now, he does once again have one of those pin swivels at the elbow, so no double joints sadly. It can rotate all the way around. This time the gauntlet doesn't seem to move, it seems to be sculpted in, which is a shame. The other thing I had to mention is about that single joint at the elbow is that it does feel quite flimsy, and I did worry that I might snap something with it, so that's something to keep in mind when you're trying to pose this figure. Now, it does have the pin swivel at the wrist, so the hand will rotate all the way around, and of course it will hinge forwards and backwards as well, but again, I would caution you to be gentle with it because the joints are quite slim and slender, and I don't want to snap anything. Did also want to point out that when it comes to the cape, you're not going to be able to move that arm at all, so that's kind of redundant, which is a real shame. He does have a swivel at the waist, so he can move from side to side. This time there's no ab crunch, which is disappointing. His legs will hinge out at the side, which doesn't look great, but it's fine. The legs will kick forwards, they'll kick backwards. There is a single joint at the knee this time, no double joint, which is a shame. He does have a swivel at the top of the boot, but sadly this time he only has a hinge at the ankle. He's a little lighter than Batman when it comes to accessories. He does come with an additional 2 pairs of hands, which is nice to see. He also has a grapple gun moulded into his hand, which is cool, and then he has his bowlers as well. Okay, so final thoughts on the Robin. I'm only gonna give him 2 stars. And a lot of this has to do with the cell shading, and it's kind of difficult for me to get past. I just think it kind of ruins the aesthetic with this figure. I just think if they just chosen a slightly different colour, it would be a lot better. This just feels a little bit too bright and a little bit too yellow, and it just looks kind of strange. The other issue I have with this figure is the articulation. He's definitely much more limited than the Batman figure, and yeah, it's really disappointing that we're losing that shoulder articulation there because the choice they've gone for in terms of the material with that cape. The other thing is that with the original release in the DC Collectibles line, the interior of the cape was actually a yellow, so he's a bit more colourful. Here they've just gone for black all around. Again, that's probably up to preference, but I think it's more screen accurate to have it as yellow. So I'm kind of disappointed with how they've treated the cape all in all, and there's something about the figure that feels a little bit static and a bit unusable really. That said, you can still get some cool striking poses with them, and it's great pairing them up together. As you can see here, I think they look really nice together on display, but as a standalone figure, he's definitely the weaker of the two in this wave. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like, and remember to subscribe as there'll be plenty more videos soon.